Uday Pratap Singh. You're joining us on NewsX. Moscow has stoked fears of an energy war by threatening to close a major gas pipeline to Germany after the US pushed its European allies to consider banning Russian oil imports over its invasion of Ukraine. Russian Deputy Prime Minister said a rejection of Russian oil would lead to catastrophic consequences for the global market. The White House has said the US President Joe Biden has made no decision at this stage on a possible ban on imports of Russian oil and gas. Biden has urged his EU allies to levy embargoes on Russian oil imports. German Chancellor Olaf rejected the proposal outright, saying Russian gas imports are essential for the functioning of the German economy. Other EU nations who are heavily reliant on Russian energy are reluctant to impose sanctions on Moscow. Joining us at this point is Ambassador Bhashwati Mukherjee, former diplomat. We also have Sharat Kohli, senior economist, live with us. Professor Asif Ramiz Dodi, South and Middle East Asia foreign policy expert, is live with us. Gautam Mukherjee, senior journalist, also joins us live. Gautam Mukherjee, let me bring you in here on how this is really panning out. It's not going the way the EU or the US would have wanted, because if they're not imposing embargoes or banning exports or banning imports rather, how will the Russians have pressure put on them?
Well, this is a very difficult one, because if, what Russia has threatened to do is the old pipeline, which is operational, Nord 1, they said, look, if you keep doing this, we'll shut it off. If that happens, then gas and oil prices, particularly gas, double in Germany. It's one thing for America to urge sanctions on oil and gas while they sit across the Atlantic, far away from the conflict zone, far away from Russia to that matter, and, sort of crack the whip on Europe. What, from my point of view, is rather welcome is this kind of thing could develop fresh fissures in the NATO alliance, which can be beneficial to, de-escalation of this whole conflict. Because up to now, it's been scaremongering the Europeans into arming up, on moving arms and ammunition and people and troops into Eastern Europe, beginning to involve Poland in the actual supply line of armaments. Now, this is perhaps a choke point that is unacceptable to Germany and perhaps some of the others. Let's see how this develops, but this is a good sign.
Ambassador Mukherjee, come in here on your take on this big developing story. Is this a setback with Germany saying no to, to sanctioning Russia, to banning imports?
All I can say is that this American demand on Germany is a demonstration of how little the Americans understand how much Germany, and for that matter Netherlands, is dependent on the Russian gas and supply line. In fact, one of the reasons why earlier Germany was one of the strongest proponents of some kind of détente with the Russian Federation was because its energy needs were being supplied from Russia. And in the middle of a hard winter, where they have complete dependence on this supply, it is totally unrealistic for the Americans and for President Biden to expect that they would plunge the German economy and the German people into a kind of cold storage situation, because it takes time not only to diversify, but as we realized during the Iraq crisis, when you diversify, you get different kinds of gas or crude. You have to change the entire pattern of supply and storage. So it's quite a complicated process, and it is completely unrealistic to expect Germany to do so. Moreover, as Mr. Gautam Mukherjee said, it also gives a completely wrong signal, if you please, from the Americans to the Russians, that this is not something that the European Union and the Germans will agree to. And therefore, it also demonstrates if Mr. Zelensky is listening, that there are many, many cracks in the so-called united anti-Russian front, and that it would be in President Zelensky's interest to try and negotiate a settlement as quickly as possible. And I also like to say that the effort to bring in Poland is extremely dangerous, because that would be seen, according to international law, as bringing in Poland directly into the conflict, because the Americans want Poland to supply cheap Russian aircraft to Ukraine, and in return for which they would get new aircraft from the Americans. That means that Poland would then become a party to the conflict. And is Poland willing to do that? Given Poland's troubled history, I think I would be very, very surprised if any Polish government would get drawn into such a conflict. I don't think so at all. So yes, I would agree that this gives a completely wrong impression of a divided West, but it does help to put pressure on Zelensky that if the West is not united in helping him, if they're not giving him foot soldiers, they are not willing to cut off the precious gas and oil supplies from Russia, then it is in his interest, if he doesn't want 2 million refugees outside, if he doesn't want his country to become another Syria, it is in his interest to get into a peace agreement where there would be many countries, including India, to help in ensuring that Ukraine gets a fair deal. If he would agree, there are many, including India. We've already said that we are there to help both sides, and both sides means we would also help Ukraine. We would ensure, we would do our best to ensure that certain concessions would be made. We are very well situated to put some pressure on the Russians also in that context. Uday.
Okay, let me bring in Sharat Kohli at this point as well. Sharat Kohli, on the fact that this is not really turning out to be what the United States would have wanted, the kind of embargoes, sanctions which aren't being put on Russia, after all, to put pressure on them. Is it just practical consideration by each country?
Well, yes, Uday. NATO. If you see the character of NATO all these years, I mean, it was a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, no doubt, but never before has NATO seen the necessity to get together, huddle up the way they have to right now. It was more of like any other organization, a few nations getting together for a certain cause, but never before, I think, was this need felt. So I think all the nations of NATO has been taken aback by the forced unity that they have to now show, whether they like it or they don't like it. Never had they dreamt that probably this kind of unity will have to be displayed. The situation would demand where they have to come together militarily or economically. So I think all the NATO members have landed into a situation where they have to get together. If they don't get together, then they don't, pose a united front there. And Russia, mind you, Russia is totally aware of this fact. Russia knew from the beginning that NATO has been formed. It was worried about NATO, worried about Ukraine going into NATO, worried about NATO walking into towards its borders, and so on and so forth. But from the inside, I think President Putin knows that there are fissures in this whole NATO structure. And I think this is very clearly evident now because, half of the gas, let's talk of Germany, half of the gas, 1/3 of the coal, quarter of the oil, what will a country like Germany do? So, we in Hindi say that if you're taking a panga, you better be realizing the effect of that. You are trying to do something and, more out of emotion, sanction this, sanction that, sanction take. Russia makes Russia as an outcast, but the impact needs to be very closely studied before you take such steps. Now, for America to say, ban everything, for people to say, ban everything, don't take Russian oil is loaded with Ukrainian blood and so, all these statements, they are not practical statements. As Ambassador Mukherjee rightly said, Europe can freeze. Their houses are heated by this gas. It's their main energy source. In fact, on the hindsight, we should thank these energy resources that they have kept the world together. if each country was independent, Uday, with no dependence for economically or for import export for any of kind of mineral resources, we would have seen the world war much before the time that we are anticipating, for that matter. So let us for a moment thank petrol, thank diesel, thank gas, thank coal, that we are still in a situation where, the chances of a world war or the chances of a nuclear war are still distinct. Now, we keep talking about it. We've been talking about it all these days, and any day, it could be any day, any moment. But simple reason why it hasn't happened is because countries, it's a global village now. Countries are entwined with each other. You cannot isolate yourself. So now the billion-dollar question, Uday, is going to be: I had made a list of all the economic sanctions on Russia. If all these sanctions were to come into force, now I'm giving you a very useful piece of information, Uday. If all these sanctions, including PayPal, including MasterCard, Visa card, SWIFT, these oligarchs being banned and so on and so forth, if they were all to be coming into effect, if I was President Putin, my country would come to a standstill vis-a-vis finance, vis-a-vis economics. I'll be an economic outcast. I mean, neither can my people deal with the world, nor can the rest of the world deal with my people. My country can't export, my country can't import. How will a country as big as Russia survive? So I think the sanctions which have been imposed right now, other than oil, they need to be seen in the perspective. They need to be seen with a realistic lens, I would say. So I think it's a very difficult situation, a very tightrope one. I think NATO is beginning to realize that after all, they were not as united as the rest of the world thought they were.
Okay, let me take that across to Professor Asif Dodi as well. Professor Asif Dodi, come in here on whether relook at the strategy is needed, whether the fact is that you aren't going to get Germany and other EU countries to change their strategy because they are reliant on gas, they are reliant on Russian oil and Russian energy. So is this just a practical failure of this sanctions plan, or is a relook and a reset needed, which could have perhaps further stringent consequences for Russia? Professor Asif? Okay, I'm being told we've lost him there, unfortunately. Why don't you take that, Gautam Mukherjee, on whether a reset is needed, or is it something which won't change the view of these EU nations, including Germany, as they're just too heavily reliant?
Uday, I'm certain that a lot of the strategists in Europe who are in the front line of being affected by this hysteria of sanctions and trying to pile on numerically as many, even if they are unrelated to immediate pressure to stop the war, are thinking ahead. And when they think ahead, they're going to come to the conclusion that Kiev will fall, Zelensky will be ousted. I don't think Putin's going to talk to him, not really. The foreign ministers will be speaking, but Russia is going to lay the same conditions it did, like it always has, and they will not be acceptable because Zelensky is a puppet of the Americans and NATO. And that part of NATO, which is still, at least in the letter of it, hanging on to the American line. So what happens next? Ukraine will have new leadership, which is acceptable to Russia, and that leadership will conform to what the Russians want. Russia will next put pressure on NATO for a rollback from all the remaining former USSR satellites and cite the misuse of Poland for a start. Now, so in other words, Zelensky is not a stable leader that you should bother with. He's there for now, but how much longer is the question. Now, as far as whatever has been done so far by way of trying to contain Russia, they have been an abject failure, and the reluctance to get involved in a direct fight is the opposite of what Russia is about. Russia is quite happy to get involved in a direct fight. It is not worried about the nuclear threat because it's got the nuclear threat on its hands as well. And so this is a Mexican standoff in which the West and NATO is bound to lose.
Okay. Let me, in fact, quickly go back to Ambassador Bhashpati Mukherjee as well at this point. Ambassador Bhashpati Mukherjee, come in here on whether a reset is needed on this embargo strategy, on this sanction strategy. Should the US intervene to try and get Germany and other nations to change their minds? What kind of reset is needed for their strategy?
First of all, Uday, the unilateral levying of sanctions without going through the UN Security Council is a violation of international law. According to the Charter of the United Nations, sanctions can only be imposed through the Security Council. And therefore, the unilateral levying of sanctions by the West, earlier on some other countries and now on the Russian Federation, is totally, completely illegal. Secondly, because it is illegal, it doesn't have the sanction of international law. Therefore, they can be imposed unilaterally and either through force or through coercion. There's no other way of imposing those sanctions. Those sanctions do not apply to other countries at all. That's the first thing. Now, the second is that if United States tries to coerce Germany into accepting sanctions on Russian oil and gas, what in effect United States is asking Germany to do is to put its economy in irreversible recession and to cut off heating in a very cold winter to 80% of German citizens. That would also happen to the Netherlands, where I was ambassador, and to several other countries who are totally dependent on Russian oil. Now, that is not going to be accepted by the democratically elected governments of these countries. They have been elected for the welfare of their people. They cannot agree. And therefore, in my view, this is mere kite flying as far as the oil and gas part of it is concerned. As far as the rest is concerned, Zelensky must be knowing that the fall of Kiev and the major part of Ukraine into Russian hands is imminent. That is exactly why at the lower level, he is not stopping the local forces from keeping our students hostage, because he must be hoping that given the kind of relationship that India has with the Russian Federation and Prime Minister Modi with Putin, Putin would be very hesitant to put India in a situation where its young nationals would be in danger of losing their lives. That is precisely why they are not being released. Now, if you look at Zelensky's pattern of behavior, this is not the pattern of behavior expected from the president of a sovereign state or a rational person. He is holding hostage 720 Indian nationals, knowing that ultimately the Russians will not wait forever. They will move. And when they move, if the Ukrainians then decide to do the worst with our nationals and try to put the blame on the Russians, in the fog of war and war clouds, nobody will really know with clarity what happened. And that is precisely what Zelensky wants, which is why in such a situation, we have to put the maximum pressure on Zelensky through the West, which supports him, through the presidents and heads of state who have been in long dialogue with him, like the French President Macron, like the Israeli head of state, to get our nationals out, because my first preoccupation right now is that in this situation, which is worsening day by day, and where there is an imminent danger of the capital of Ukraine falling into Russian hands, the Ukrainians may try to take revenge through our nationals. That is not an acceptable situation. So I think, I agree with Mr. Gautam Mukherjee that those sanctions are too overreaching in a globalized world where economies are interconnected. Those sanctions, if they are implemented, will put the economy of the European Union, which some parts of which were very badly hit by the pandemic, into an irreversible recession. Those sanctions, if they are implemented, would destroy the German economy. Germany's economy is the engine of the European Union economy. The EU cannot afford to allow that to happen. And it is very, very easy and comfortable for the Americans to say this because they are sitting on oil supplies, they are sitting on shale, they are a continent away. If there is a nuclear, if there is even a minor nuclear exchange of nuclear weapons, they know very well that even if the wind current changes, it may reach Western Europe, but it will never go across the Atlantic to United States. So they are in a very privileged position. They are protected from sanctions. They are protected from any nuclear conflict, and they are trying to manipulate the major European Union countries and Poland in a situation where they would get directly involved in the war, and then the war could spread, and it could indeed become a limited world war. We are only steps away from a limited world war. So the situation is very dangerous, but my first preoccupation as an Indian diplomat is how do we get those 720 Indian nationals back to safety. Uday.
Yes, Sharat Kohli, come in here on of course, back now to the main premise, of course, of the debate of the energy war. Moscow, of course, stoking fears also of this energy war by actually threatening to close a gas pipeline which leads to Germany after the US, of course, further pushed its European allies, and of course, maybe they will in the next few days as well. How do you react to the possibility of this energy war and these statements by Russia?
Well, Uday, I mean, the war is, as of now, more out of words. And if you go into the realm of things, Russia has foreign exchange reserves of $630 billion, which is pretty much coincidentally equal to the Indian forex reserve. And back of the envelope calculation says that around 80% of those reserves have been built out of export of energy, which is gas, oil, coal, or take for example, gas and oil. Now, for a country which is already now ceased to deal with America and Western Europe on most of the things. It's been taken out of SWIFT for most of the banks, not all of them. All the major, the big four firms have moved out. Some of the big corporations have moved out. You tell me now what I mentioned earlier as well. How will a country like Russia survive in this case when its foreign exchange assets have been freezed? I'm seeing a situation where the war drags on, Uday, for some more time. Or even if war stops for now, let's say Kiev falls and he places his president, will the sanctions be reversed? The answer is no, they will not be reversed. Now, if the sanctions, so it's a very difficult situation. If the sanctions continue, they are in trouble. If the war stops, they are still in trouble. So I think Russia is being cornered. So now I'm taking the other side of the coin. Can Russia afford to say that just get lost? I don't want to send any oil to you. Where will it be sending its oil? Will all the oil go to China? Will all the oil go to Malaysia or Indonesia? The answer is no. You have to look at the big customers who were primarily consuming your oil, and they were giving you foreign exchange reserve. We are looking at a country which is more than 1 crore kilometers, of total length. You have to see that what are your revenue resources today. I mean, you can replicate this example to India. Each $10 of oil increase, Uday, is leading to a 0.2 to 0.3% fall in the GDP. It is affecting your current account deficit. It is affecting your balance of payment. It is affecting your import bill. Do you think Russia, which is much smaller as an economy than India, it is only $1.7 trillion. India is almost double the size, almost $3 trillion. Do you think such a country would be able to survive with the principal source of revenue getting killed? The answer is no. So I think when these words are being spoken, Uday, whether they need to be taken in letter and spirit is the billion-dollar question. Are you only giving dhamkis, or are they real threats? Are you actually going to implement? Because if you do a real implementation of these threats, you are literally going to collapse as an economy. I mean, I'm going back to 1991, the Soviet collapse. I'm sure the people sitting on the panel are very, very knowledgeable. They obviously know, but for the sake of viewers, what happened in 1991? I mean, economic collapse was a principal reason apart from the other geopolitical. Let's forget about the geopolitical and the, the intra-country reasons. Basically, it was economics behind the collapse of Soviet Union. So are we looking at another collapse of the Russian Federation? Putin is never going to let that happen. So, what needs to be seen now is that how much of these threats will actually be put into action. IMF, World Bank, they have all said that the global economy is in danger. And when you impose sanctions, a very important point here, when you impose sanctions on somebody, they are two-way sanctions. It's like picking up a burning coal in your hand and throwing it on somebody's house. Now that house may get burnt or not, there may be rain or there could be a shower, but your hand is definitely going to be burnt. So the sanction effect is the two-way effect. Your own country also gets impacted significantly. I think we have to move into the realm of things, and if this really gets into action, I hope not, but if it does, I think the consequences will be catastrophic. The consequences will be devastating. Then the only option left with Putin is, I don't even want to talk about it, but for the sake of the discussion, I can mention it. He will have no option left but to destroy Europe, destroy West, because he knows his country is going to be destroyed economically. He would like to militarily destroy, and that is where the nuclear threat becomes realistic, Uday.
All right, let's leave it at that. My thanks to all of our guests for joining us on this debate.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.